one important thing is that when you get down to the self, there are two streams. There's the shadow stream, and there's we could say it's the light side and the shadow side. Now, the shadow isn't always bad because the shadow helps us have psychic energy. So we have to recognize first that the shadow is not always bad. But we have to then take the two streams. One is a conscious side and one is an unconscious side, or an ego side and a self side. And we have to evaluate what the dream is telling us in terms of the 21st century and in terms of our everyday life. So, as Dr. Jung used to say it, and I don't recall exactly what the Latin is, but he used to say we have to test the spirits and realize that the psyche is coming out at us in both streams, okay, in both sides of the opposites. And so when we're getting a message from the psyche, we have to then evaluate that message in terms of of our 21st century life. And at the same time, you don't want to sometimes things that the psyche says that it wants, you don't want to bring into your actual life. You shouldn't do. And there are many of these. The point is that our psyche sometimes tells us it wants us to do things, and we shouldn't, and we should be conscious enough, ego conscious enough to make that decision. But very often I get useful messages from my psyche, and I've mentioned a few times that when I get a vision of a police car, it's always the same vision. It's a black and white police car with the word police written across the side of it, and it appears to cross in front of me from right to left. When I get that vision, no matter when it is, I always slow down and pay attention, because within 2 minutes I will see some police activity. Very often it's a speed trap or something like that, but it may be, an accident beside the road or anything else that might involve the police. But in any case, that vision always warns me about a minute or two in advance that I'm going to see police activity. Now, maybe that can be explained by seeing changes in the speed of oncoming traffic or something like that. It certainly works in that way for me. In other words, a lot of people feel they need to have a radar detector on their dashboard, and that when they go by police, they hide it if it's illegal in your state. But many people do have radar detectors in their cars. I have no need of that, because whenever I'm near a speed trap on the highway, I have that vision, and it warns me. And so I've learned to pay attention to that. And by vision, I mean, as we go along in life, we're thinking about things all the time, and we have, we think in images, so images come up. And so when if you turn off the radio and then you start to pay attention to the images that come to mind as you're going along, you can find correspondences like that, like my police car, because I started to notice about 30 years ago that anytime I had that vision, within a minute or two, I would see some police activity, and very often it was a speed trap. And I'm sure other things come to mind also very often. And so you need to pay attention to these things and learn. Now, as it happened, when I broke my leg, I was flat on my back for 13 weeks. It took 13 weeks to repair. And so what had started in the fall of '89, I then resumed, and that then led to a series of events which led to taking a company public in 2005. And that's a very long story, as you might guess, but the point is that maybe my psyche was, in a very rough way, telling me to focus on that opportunity and not on the opportunity of trying to become a general officer in the Marine Corps Reserve. And so fortunately, I had enough years of activity in the Marine Corps that I was able to retire, and that helped me. Let's see. Roland Benner says, I tried to fight the Psyche and the Psyche won. That's why I'm here. Precisely. I think, and certainly that's why I'm here. And, when I think about this piece that I read about speaking in tongues, and especially about the reaction of the three psychologists who went to a talk of Dr. Jung's, I find that whenever I have any difficulty in life that I'm facing, if I pick up one of Jung's direct books and begin to read anywhere in the book, it calms me down. And does it directly address my concerns? Very often it does. I mean, there's surprising synchronicity there, but nonetheless, for whatever reason, it does calm me down. And I'm quite intuitive, and so I recognize these things having effect on me. And, I basically think of Dr. Jung as my shrink. And there's a famous story that Dr. Jung told of a man, an Indian man who came to visit him, and he was quite a prominent Indian man. And Dr. Jung said to him, well, who is your guru? And the man gave a name, and Dr. Jung said, do you mean the guru who lived in the 13th century? And the Indian said, yes, I mean him. and so ironically, I used to think of, I started thinking of Joseph Campbell as my guru. And years ago now, probably, must have been 87 or something like that, I heard on NPR about a book about Joseph Campbell's life called Fire in the Mind. It's a very worthwhile book. I highly recommend it. It's called Fire in the Mind. And it's a biography of Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell had a variety of experiences in his early life in particular. He, let's see, who... can't remember. He was living with a famous author back in the early days, back in the late 30s or early 40s, in California. I think they were living on a houseboat or something like that. And so there are some very interesting stories in that book. But that got me interested in Joseph Campbell, so I started to read a lot of his work. And then I lost respect for him, unfortunately. And the way that happened was that Well, it was two things. One was that Joseph Campbell had been very taken by James Joyce's book, Finnegan's Wake. And he actually wrote a book called Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake. So Joseph Campbell was sort of working in the way that Edinger worked with Dr. Jung's work. Joseph Campbell was working with James Joyce's work. And Finnegan's Wake, as you may know if you've tried to read it, is a very complicated and difficult book to read. And it's layered about at least 8 or 10 layers deep, almost every word in it, especially in the first 40 or 50 pages. And if you're not familiar with the ancient references that James Joyce uses in the beginning of Finnegan's Wake, you're just not going to get it. It's very difficult to understand when you first pick it up. I remember picking it up in college because some part of it was required for my freshman or sophomore English lit class, and I probably got through no more than a page. But one of the interesting things about Finnegan's Wake is that it begins with the end of a sentence, and it ends with the beginning of the same sentence. So it is round, and it is referring, that sentence is referring to the river Libby, I think, that goes through Dublin, and how it's a constant cycle of the water going out to sea and then coming back and raining down and coming down the river again. And so it's also a reference to the round of life. And so, but if you didn't know that he was using that artifice, you wouldn't even realize that the beginning of the sentence was the last part, the very last words in the book, until you got to the end of the book, and you'd have to be very good attention span to even realize that was there. You'd get to the end of the sentence and you'd say, okay, why did it sort of just trail off? And ironically, that's what happens in the Red Book, in Dr. Jung's Red Book, which I can show you in a minute. But the point was that that Campbell went to the opening of By the Skin of Our Teeth, which was a play by Oscar Wilde. And halfway through the play, he got up very angrily and made comments to the rest of the audience that this was plagiarism of Finnegan's Wake. And he stormed out of the premiere very noticeably. And I thought that was quite ironic because Joseph Campbell, in much of his writing, was actually plagiarizing Carl Jung in much the same way. So that was one realization that I had. But in fairness, I have to say that I like a lot of Joseph Campbell's work and books, and I still have them on my shelf. And so anyway, there was this other thing, though, where I was listening to audio tapes again, and I was listening to an audio tape with Joseph Campbell back in, the very early 90s, I would say. And it was after I had broken my leg, and so I was starting that business, and I was doing a lot of traveling salesman type work at that time. And I remember sitting in the, believe it or not, I remember explicitly sitting in the parking lot of Onslow Memorial Hospital in Jacksonville, North Carolina. That's exactly where I was when I heard this part of this tape. And there was a question and answer period in the tape. And one of the women in the audience got up and asked him, well, Dr. Campbell, what is the meaning of life? And Joseph Campbell was very derisive, and it was after this that I turned off toward him, because he said, oh, there's no meaning to life, there's only an experience of life. And of course, that's one thing he didn't plagiarize from Dr. Jung, because Dr. Jung did say that everybody has to have meaning in their lives, or we're going to have problems psychologically. And so, but I didn't know that at the time. I just was turned off by the way he handled that question. And that was sort of the end for me in terms of paying attention to Joseph Campbell. And I think it was shortly after that I started to pick up some of the Jungian analysts' recent works, like Women Who Run with the Wolves, and Gods in Every Woman, and or Goddesses in Every Woman, and Gods in Every Man by Shinoda Bolen. The first other one was by Clarissa, Pinkola, Estes. Those are excellent books, by the way. I highly recommend them, but I started to read those in lieu of Joseph Campbell.